name is Casey Williams, Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of Spring Hill, Tennessee, and welcome to Brilliant Strokes. Brilliant Strokes is an intergenerational art program provided by the Arts Build Communities Grant through the Tennessee Arts Commission. And if you would like to be a part of this program, you can register online through the city website, www.springhilltn.org, or through the Parks and Recreation's Facebook page. All of our instructors are local artists, and we are so grateful to them for donating their time and their talents to be part of this unique program. Have fun!
Hey, and welcome back. I'm Susan Elizabeth Jones, and today is week 2 of our watercolor class. Now, last week, if you were with us, you know that we blocked our paper, and it's very important when you are learning to paint with watercolor that you're planning to frame. Now, in weeks 3, 4, and 5, we're actually going to be working with our watercolor journals. And these are really good for beginners because you don't have to block the paper. The paper has either been pre-blocked or it's meant to be wonky, and I like it that way because it looks very vintagey when it's in your journal. But you don't want that if your painting is going to be under glass in a frame. So just to give you kind of a teaser, I was going to show you my journal. I happen to have brought it today for another reason. But this is a travel journal that I use when I travel and will paint just absolutely anything. Teacup that I thought was really pretty, some tulips that were blooming at Cheekwood, the beach in Isle of Palms, South Carolina, another Isle of Palms scene. This is a moose I was painting on the plane flying out to Denver. A painting of Monet that I had seen at the Denver Art Museum. This is a study of a Picasso from the Frist Art Museum in Nashville. And then yesterday, I did a study at the Cheekwood Art Museum of an Emile Gruppe painting called The Yankee, and did the watercolor wash in the studio yesterday. So these are some teasers of upcoming classes we've got going on that'll be in your journal, so you can pull those out. Robin will be with you next week, and she's going to teach you how to make a cover page for those journals. That's really, really pretty. And also we'll create a key so you can see what colors are in your palette. This is my watercolor kit, and I don't know if you've noticed, but especially when you start getting into the dark colors, you can't tell if they're blue, if they're a certain shade of blue, if they're blue or purple or black or green, or they just get really, really dark. Even the reds and oranges and browns kind of blend together. So if you've never painted before, you do want to go ahead and paint a key so you can see what the color is going to look like on paper opposed to what it looks like in your tin. Okay, so today we're going to get started with a painting that we're going to put under glass, framed. And I chose just a very simple flower in a vase, and I intentionally printed it to where it's out of focus. With watercolor, you want that kind of dreamy, loose feel. And it doesn't matter if your reference is in focus or not. I just happen to have done that because it helps me get in that watercolor mood. Also, the paper we're using is cold pressed, which has a real tooth to it, meaning it's thick and kind of bumpy. And that's also going to make for a more painterly painting. Now, I paint using the John Singer Sargent approach to watercolor painting, and he's not really known for his watercolor paintings, but if you've ever seen him, especially up close, you can see the pencil marks underneath the watercolor washes. Watercolor is a transparent medium, meaning that you can see through it. So if you're going to make a road map for yourself using a pencil, you want to do that really light so that it's not so apparent once you put your watercolor wash on top. So I've got a mechanical pencil here, and I have gone ahead and taken my reference photo and folded it in half, opened it up, fold it in half again, so that I've got 4 equal quadrants with a grid in that pressed edge, and that's going to help me block in my basic shape. So if I put in just a very light, and I know you can't see this because I can barely see it, but that's intentional. Remember, we want this to be so light you can't see it. Grid. And the flower is kind of at a 35-degree angle above that line, about a 45-degree angle that way, almost a 90-degree this way. So I've got my basic shapes here. Now if I wanted to, I could go ahead and erase that grid. One, so it doesn't confuse me when I see it on there. And number two, so it doesn't show through when I go to paint on top of it. Now another thing I can do you see how it's pretty white in the foreground on the tabletop, but then all of a sudden there's a change in value where probably there is a plane change where you've hit a wall and it gets darker going up. I do have a line there, but because there's 2 separate colors, I could paint my darker of the 2 colors and then erase that line, and then the lighter of the 2 colors and not have that line at all. In fact, I may go ahead and just go ahead and erase that horizon line back here, because I think I can eyeball it and know where I want that to go to. So step number 1 is to block your paper. You want it to be completely dry by the time you block in your basic shapes. Excuse me. And we use a pencil. I just use a regular pencil, and I paint it and I draw it in very, very lightly. I don't use any pressure, and I also don't just do straight lines. You'll see how I'm holding the pencil, it's way back here, and just lightly sketch that in little tick marks, just little bitty lines. Like that. Okay, so we're through with the block in. And now we want to start doing our washes. It does not matter if you start with the background and come forward, or the foreground and go back, or up in one corner and down in another corner. What matters is, because we're using a water medium, we don't want to paint on top of each other where that water is going to make the color run unless we want it to. So that has to be planned. So what I will probably do is paint the background in the upper portion first and let that be drying while I paint down here in the vase or the reflection, and then go back and do the flower itself. Now, I don't want it to run, but please don't worry if yours does, because if it does, magic happens. Sometimes it's the most beautiful process and it looks like you intended to do it that way. So don't worry about it, just practice and let's see what happens. Now, we do want to paint very lightly. And the reason why we do that is because watercolor as a medium is very unforgiving. And if we do mess up, we want to be able to pull that color out. And it's so much easier to pull it out if you started light and then built up that value with more and more pigment to make it darker. Also, you paint light to dark because we use the white of the paper to be our white. I always tell people there's no such thing as white watercolor paint, but as soon as I say that, you're going to correct me and go, yes, there is. I see it right here. What that white is for is to mix with your other colors Let's say you don't see baby pink in here anywhere, but you need a baby pink color. You may take some of your white watercolor and some of your red watercolor and mix that together to get a nice baby pink, but you don't use the white to try to add white on here. You want that to come from your paper. Now, if you mess up and you can't get it back to white where it needs to be, or you want a white that just absolutely glows off the page, then I recommend investing in some gouache. And this is Turner Design Gouache. And gouache is also a water medium, but it is an opaque water medium where watercolor paint is transparent. So watercolor transparent, gouache opaque. And I have gouache in every color because I'll paint with gouache sometimes. But really and truly, most watercolor painters just have gouache in white. Now, I do have some gouache that's here from where I was painting yesterday. And if I really wanted to use the gouache, I need to put more out. But I did not clean this off my mixing wells because it's reconstitutable with, is that a word? You can reconstitute it with water. So even though it's completely dried, it's like my half pans of watercolor paint that are completely dry. It'll come back to life once you add some water to it. So let's get painting. I'm going to start with a bigger brush, and I'm going to wet that brush, and I'm going to mix a color that's going to be this background color. Now, that's kind of a smooshy, dark, nondescript color back there. I want that to be in the blue family. And the reason why I want that in the blue family is because blue is the opposite of orange, which is the color of my flower. And I might even put a little purple in there just to see here. Yeah, I love that color. It's not the same color. It's not the same color, but because I'm the artist, I can fudge that. Nobody's going to see my reference photo. And so I added the pigment there. I'm just going to use just some white, just some clear water and work that up so that it gets paler as it goes toward the top of the page. Now, normally I don't paint on an easel because of gravity, that water's going to run down. But if I painted flat on the table, which is what I would be doing if I was in the studio, you wouldn't be able to see it. So if you can imagine, if we have a drip or a run, that would not happen if this was flat on the table. Now, I can take a paper towel and absorb a little bit of that water just so it doesn't run too bad. Okay, so do you see how I have more pigment down here? And then it gets lighter as it goes up? Once that dries, it's actually going to get even lighter. And I often will compare it to shampooing your hair. Even if you're a blonde, a very light color blonde, when you wash your hair and the hair is wet, it almost looks brown. But as it dries, it becomes blonde again. So hair is lighter when it's dry and it's darker when it's wet. Same thing with watercolor. When it's wet, it's nice and dark. You think you've got the right color. And as it dries, it just fades. So if I want that color to remain that color, once it's dry, I might have to put another layer on there. Or it might be perfect just the way it is. So I'm going to allow that to dry while I work in another area of the painting, and then I can go back and revisit whether I want to darken it up or not. So since I've got that nice purple color already on my brush, I'm going to go ahead and paint my clear glass. Now, clear glass, you can't paint it because it's clear. But what happens is you either paint what's behind it, what's in it, or what's reflecting on it, or the shadows that it casts. Seems to be dark around the edge. It's dark around here at the bottom. It's also casting a shadow that's not quite as dark. And there's not really an occlusion shadow here, but I may want to put one in there anyway, just to try to show what's going on. Now I do want to darken some of this up, but it's bleeding into the rest where it's wet, so I may have to come back and darken that up once that has dried a little bit. Okay, now this is almost dry, and I'm already beginning to see a little bit of the wobbliness in the paper. It happens even when you block it, it just doesn't do it as bad. The other thing, I think I mentioned last week that the blue tape has pros and cons. It won't tear the paper because it doesn't stick that well, so it's really good not to tear your paper when you're finished. But it also doesn't stick to the board really well either, especially when that paper was wet and it already changed the glue a little bit. So you might have to go back and work with those edges and get those down again. The other choice is masking tape, which holds it perfectly. But then when you go to remove it, you have to be really, really careful and remove it at an angle or it will tear your painting. So it's just, you just have to decide which one you like the best. So I do think that's pretty well dry where we can go ahead and start putting in our peach color. So now I'm going to reconstitute that orange, come over to a well. I'm even gonna do a darker orange. So we got two different colors of orange going on. I'm going to reconstitute that white because we've got a lighter orange going on. Throw in some of that color. Some of the darker colors over here. I'm gonna grab some yellow. around the edges it's really, really light. So it might even be some yellow and white, or it might be some orange and white. It's almost like being backlit. It gets darker down here. So I'm going to add some of that purple in there so it gets darker. It gets a little more chromatic over on this edge. Okay, and we'll leave that alone, see what happens. Meanwhile, I'm going to get my green going. Some reflection of that green in the glass.
I might even want to darken up some of that purple.
Darken up some of the green in the shadow.
Darken that up a little bit.
Clean water on a clean brush, just kind of move that pigment up so that it fades as it goes up. clean brush, just moving a little bit of that color around. Okay. Now I have to make a decision about the background here. I think if you remember, I told you that the white in your picture comes from the white of the paper. So it's quite possible that we could just leave that completely white if we wanted to. I could decide that this line is too much of a sharp edge that I want to soften. And if I want to do that, then I can add a lot more water to the pigment so that it's more water than pigment. And I can come down and soften that edge just a little bit as it goes the other direction. Just a little bit. And yes, I often get my fingers involved here. I'm going to add some black and green together, get that dark. Because it gets really dark in there. Okay. What I want to do now is I want to live with the painting. I want to let it go ahead and dry. And then I have to make a decision. At that point, do I want to soften anything? Do I want to lighten anything? Do I want to darken anything? If I did want to lighten something, it's very hard to do in watercolor, but what you can do is take a clean paper towel, wrap it around your finger, add a little water to it, and try to pull some of that pigment out. So if I wanted it lighter around this edge, I could lighten it up. You see how that's lightening up that edge? And I think that'll work enough to where I don't need to bring the gouache out. But if I wanted to, I could reconstitute that gouache. And honestly, it's already contaminated with another color, so it's not really white at this point. So I would need to get more clean gouache out of the tube. Okay, I think I like it. Now what I don't typically do is a pen and ink overlay unless I need to go really light in one area or really dark in one area. So for this particular painting, I don't need to do that. So I'm not going to bring out a pen. But let's say I didn't have any gouache, but I had a white gel pen and I wanted to add a little highlight here, or I wanted a reflection on the glass. I could take the white gel pen, or I could take the gouache and add a white highlight on the glass. Or if I had a really dark area, or I had lettering, or had anything that I needed to be really small and really specific, then I could go in with a pen and put in that detail. I really don't want to do that in any of these. But what I could do if I wanted to is to use a pen to sign my name, or to use a pencil to sign my name. Now you can use a brush, and I've got this tiny, tiny little brush that'll make a nice sharp point once it's wet. And you can add enough water to your watercolor to turn it into an ink-like consistency. And you twirl that brush in there to get a really sharp point, and then you can sign your name. But when you're painting on paper, it's perfectly acceptable to go ahead and sign your name with a pen. So I would just get a nice dark pen. Sign, even put the date if you want. Very easy to do, just do it really small. Now once this is dry, you have to remove it from the board. And what you want to do is be really, really careful. So you start with one side, and instead of ripping it off, you go very slowly at a 90-degree angle. See, I'm pulling the tape that way so that there is a 90-degree angle between where the tape is on the paper and where it's actually coming off the other direction. And that will help ensure I don't tear my paper when I take that off. You want to do that in this direction. Remember, 90 degrees. This one would go to my left, 90 degrees. And then this one as well would go up 90 degrees. So we were able to remove our painting from the board without tearing the painting. And you can see you've got this nice white border going all the way around. And had you moved your border up, you would have more room at the bottom where you could sign your name, or put the name of the painting, or where you were when you painted it, or whatever is important to you to put in your composition as part of the composition, the words that are down there. But the part that is not showing, that really is underneath the frame once this is framed. Now, the bad thing about watercolor is it has to be framed under glass. An acrylic or an oils, once it dries, it's completely waterproof. So you could take a wet rag and wash the dust off. However, watercolor can be reconstituted with water. So you can't clean this without ruining your painting. So you want to make sure you frame it under glass so that you're cleaning the glass that's on top. So I hope you practice this week. And if you have any questions, I want you to be sure and send them to me, and we're going to put my contact information down in the notes. Also, I have a YouTube channel, Susan Elizabeth Jones, with lots of videos on there with watercolor, with oils, with acrylics, and those are all free and available to you if you want to practice with those. And practice makes perfect. So you just want to get your muscle memory going. You want to get to where you know how the paint's going to behave. So the more you practice, not only the better you get, but you also start seeing your style emerging. So that's it for watercolor painting, for framed watercolor paintings. And starting next week, we're going to work in our journals. I can't wait for you to come back for that.
So, if you like what you've seen and you want to take part in Brilliant Strokes, don't forget, go online to our Facebook page, that's Spring Hill TN Parks and Recreation, or to the Spring Hill City website and register. Registration opens February 18th, and the first 8 people to register for each class will get a free goodie bag. Can't wait to get creative and have fun.